keyboard on this computer. I'm going to git clone this. What happened? This mute button, ls, cd mute button, ls, cd mute button. So, what's going on? See, back one level. I'm going to code, open this in the current working directory. And I've got mute button, which is already a existing Node or React app. Components, icons. So let's look at this. So continuing our explanation of handling interactions with events in React, we'll now create a simple UI, but without input elements. In addition to learning how to handle click events, you'll also learn how to utilize SVGs in React apps. So scaffold app, create React app, and it says render the on SVG image from the icons directory and attach an on click event handler to it. Oh no, I already kind of, looks like the solution's already here. Let me read. CD back, RF, mute button. I'm gonna go back. I'm just gonna get clone from here, kind of show you what it looks like. Git clone, CD, mute button, open that in the current working directory. Oh, come on. CD desktop, Lima, mute, code. So the only thing that's here is an icons, on and off SVG, and a git ignore file. So in here, what's the command to create a new React app?
npx create dash react dash act, and then the dot or either space dot or space name of application.
Oh, mute buttons. Mute button.
I think you just, well, I don't know if it'll work.
Yeah. I'm just going to create a React app called mute button. That's going to take a little while, but let's see what we're going to have to do. If we're using these icons in order to have access.
Can you make it so everything shows up in your current directory rather than like a nested folder?
I actually don't know.
Okay. I think space dot does that.
The space dot automatically do that with React app?
Yes.
I've never tried it before. It's a good question though. So yeah, with this specific app, we're just going to create a button that, or current app that displays an SVG of like, kind of like when you're toggling on like the mute button on and off on your Mac or on your audio player. We'll do that. So it takes a long time. And come on. And then we'll be done for the day, I promise. All right. Finally, it's done. It says right here, it kind of tells you what to do. Run npm start, starts the development server, cd mute button. So here it is, cd mute button, and then npm start. I'm going to start that React. So here's our state. It's going to override it to the new blank. All right. So Let's open up our source, open up our app.js, and let's get rid of that. Here. And the first thing we want to do is, this is a functional based component. Let's keep track of state, because we want to keep track of something, whether it is muted or not. So we need to import the React hook use state and have a const is muted and set is muted to a Boolean value equals use state. And initially, is it muted? Let's call initial value is false. And now we want to be able to toggle in between. We want to have something on the screen that we can toggle, whether it's muted or not. So we can say like a div, let's call it is muted, and let's render that. So right now, false is not showing up on the screen because false is like a falsy value, so nothing actually shows up. Let's actually render something else called, let's say, test. Here's my test. Let's change some CSS, margin top, just to give us some, let's call it 25%. Let's move that test down here. So with that, let's have an on-click event handler that every time I click this test button, it does something. So if I can do an on-click, this is supposed to toggle the mute button. So I can say like toggle mute, and then in my thing, in my function, my toggle mute function, toggle mute. I can say, I don't need to accept any event because it's not an input or anything like that. I can say set is muted to the opposite of the current value of is muted. And so let's actually console log is muted right down here. So if I refresh, initially it's false. If I click on it, it's true, false, true, false. All right. Now, let's see how we can do this. Now, we want to create a new, so if return is muted, let me see something. Cool. So we want to create an actual is muted or mute button component that's going to actually render this. So we got true, false, we got that thing working. Now let's actually create a mute button. Components, let's create buttons. Let's create a mute button.js component. Let's create a stateless component by doing RSC and then H1. This is my mute button. Let's see if this works. Oh, so I've got my mute button. Now I have to import mute button from components buttons, mute button. And now let's actually display the mute button. Mute button right there. And then here's my mute button. All right. Now, in going over state abbreviator, how can I pass down the current state of app down to the mute button component? So I need to oh, go ahead.
Props.
Yep. How do I do that? Where do I add mute button? So I need to add, you are correct that I need to pass down the is muted as props down to the mute button. How do I do that?
Line 15.
On line 16?
15.
So 15 is here. Should be line 16. So I can say is muted equals is muted. And now I can go over to my child component, which is the mute button, pass in props as an argument, and I can console log props.is muted. So when I test this, well, where am I? So I'm console logging it here. I'm going to delete that. So I've got my use state, which sets this initial state in my app component. And I'm passing down the is muted down to the mute button component as property. So here's is muted. I'm passing props into mute button, and I'm accessing the is muted value by console logging props.isMuted. So if I click this test button, it should come up here, toggle mute function, set is muted. So set is muted to the opposite of the current value of is muted. So if is muted is false, I click it, it resets it to the opposite value of is muted, which would be true. And then it would update the mute button component by passing in that is muted value as a property down here and console logging it. So if I test it right here, so it says it's console logging it at mute button JS on line 4, right there. Now in here, this is just like a normal function. So I can say if props.isMuted is true, return some div that says is muted. Let's say true. Else, I can return, let's keep this div as h1. Else return it as false. So when is muted is passed in, it comes into here, it checks if props is muted is true. This is a truthy value. I can also do true, same thing. Is true, return this h1 tag, else, I don't really need the else tag because it from progression just comes in here. If this, it returns it, otherwise just return this value. So I can say true, false, true, false, true, false.
You don't need a div in like around the H1 at line 6?
No, because it's only one, it just needs one surrounding tag. So if I wanted to do like something like this, it'll actually break because it's got two tags. It's already telling me like, hey, expression must have one parent element. And the parent element in this one just so happens to be an H1 tag. So I can even just delete that. Like so. True, false, true, false. Great. But I actually don't want true, false. I want on, off. It's initially off. It's on. Cool. So now let's do some. I don't want to be able to. I want to be able to press this button and toggle it on and off. So I don't want this little toggle thing here anymore. So I want to be able to toggle on and off by just pressing this mute button on and off. But the toggle method or the toggle function is in the app component. So does anybody have any suggestions of how I can click this button, like this on and off, like click here and have it update the state in my parent component?
Pass the setter to the child component as a prop.
So I can pass the setter, but I don't want, so I can pass the setter down.
Well, toggle mute is your setter, so you can pass toggle mute
Oh,
down, right?
okay. Thank you. So correct. I can pass the toggle mute button, the toggle mute method down, function down as a property as well. So I've got the is muted being passed down, as well as this function toggle mute. So now if I do console log props.toggle mute, so right here. So here's my toggle mute function being passed down, and mute button JS number line 4. So with that, I can add, what is it, an on click? Click equals props dot toggle mute. And I can also do that down here. On, off, on, off. So this toggle mute button is mutating this or changing the state of its parent component.
John, this is probably jumping ahead, but what if in your app.js file for toggle mute, you're passing it, right? What if I needed to pass that, but what if I needed to check the state of the mute button inside of toggle mute before I had to do a conditional against the mute button inside of that before I did anything? I need to
like
somehow
this?
pass. Yeah.
Like if this is something.
No, the state of the mute button. So I have to somehow be able to check
like this. If
is muted already a property or passes props right now?
Yeah.
So you can check it inside the component, right?
Okay, so I guess it works for yours. So the thing I guess I'm trying to do, it's very similar to this, except I don't have, my app state doesn't have the state of, it's one of the challenge projects. So it's not actually part of the state of the app. And it felt really wrong what I did. It works, but it feels really wrong. So maybe I'll get with you after this so I can show you, because it doesn't feel right, but it might be right. I don't know.
All right, yeah, we can take a look at it.
Okay.
So now we pretty much have it working. Now we just have to import the SVGs from icons into source. So we've got the icons right there. So we have to import. So import on icon from, so we have to go up one level, up 2 levels to icons to on.svg, and likewise with the off icon off. So instead of this on off, I'm going to change these to div. And then inside of this div, have an image tag with the source having, so if the is muted is true, it should be the off icon. I'm going to have an alt tag audio off. Pretty much do the same thing down here, but with the on icon. Div. Image tags in JSX does not have a closing tag on icon. Alt audio on. So let's see if this works. So there's that. So it's initially is muted as false. We can check that by doing console log props.is muted. So initially it's false. If I click it, now it's true. So now you can toggle back and forth. You can make this a little bit more efficient. Const is muted. Let's do some destructuring. This is what this is called. Toggle mute. So I'm assigning those, I'm extracting those 2 values from the props. So now I don't need to keep doing props.
Is muted with the D10 line 6.
Thank you. There we go. So I'm destructuring is muted and toggle mute from props. And everything should still work. So what questions do you have about passing data down from the parent component down to its child component as props? So you can pass down, so you can kind of, you're able to mutate or change the state of the parent component via the child component by passing down the setter, the function that changes the state of the parent down to the child component.
Would it have been equally valid to define the toggle mute function in mute button.js?
And just have all this data down here?
Yes.
Yeah, you can. But kind of like the purpose of this was to have, because you might want to have like, so the is muted, for example, might want some like audio that actually, an audio component that is actually playing the audio in here as well. So you're going to want to know whether it is muted at the parent. So when I click is muted in the in the mute button, it might have some indirect effect on the audio that's actually playing.
Okay, that makes sense. I understand.
So yeah.